Now we are discussing about booting procedure. The process of starting up is called as booting. When we are turning on the computer, we have to do our task. In between doing our task, once the computer is turned on, a process will take up. That startup process is called as booting. So this startup process will be done before the OS comes into action. When we turn on the power button, a reset signal will be sent to the CPU, and the CPU will be resetted and its registers will be set. So these registers, these CPU registers, they will initialize the CPU to the starting address of the BIOS. This is the starting address of the BIOS. Now this BIOS will come into action. Basic input output system. What the BIOS will do? BIOS says, first I will check for the post power on self test. We already discussed it. This will be done before the OS runs. For what purpose this post will be done? In order to check whether the basic hardware is properly there or not. If the basic hardware is properly there or not there, two conditions. If basic hardware is not properly there, then BIOS will give the beep signal and it will stop. If the basic hardware is properly there, then the basic hardware will be initialized. Now the disk drives, because they are also initialized, BIOS will check where is the master boot recorder in these disk drives, because already they are initialized. Once the BIOS is checking for the master boot recorder, after it finds the master boot recorder in a particular place of the disk drive, then this BIOS transfers its control to the RAM. First it copies the information of the master boot recorder to the RAM and it will transfer its control to RAM. What this master boot recorder will contain? This master boot recorder will contain the information where our operating system is there. So it contains the code to find the active partition. What is that active partition? That is nothing but our bootable partition. Generally it will be our C drive where the operating system is. So this MBR, generally in the starting 512 bytes only we will place the MBR, because it is in the starting process only we have to find the MBR. In these 512 bytes, 446 bytes we are using for the bootloader to find it is a code to find the active partition and to invoke the VBR that we will discuss. And remaining 64 bytes will be partition table. It will give the information. How much C drive, D drive, E drive, that information will be given by this partition table. After partition, the information will be, whenever we do the partition, that information will be located here in the partition table. Okay, so we discussed what is master boot recorder. Now this master boot recorder, the code is there in this master boot recorder to find the active partition and to invoke the VBR, volume boot recorder. Now this active partition, where the active partition is there, that responsibility is now in the MBR. This will try to find that. It will be in the first sector. So that first sector information, the control first sector information or OS boot sector we will call. This active MBR information will be in the first sector of the active partition. That MBR is located in the C drive first sector, OS boot sector first sector. We discussed what is sector, what is track, we already discussed it. Now this will invoke the VBR. The process is, after finding the master boot recorder, immediately the RAM will take the control. The RAM will try to take the control and BIOS will copy the information to the RAM and the BIOS task is over. Now there is no more BIOS in our picture. MBR comes into action. It will find the active partition. After finding the active partition, it will invoke the VBR, volume boot recorder. In this VBR only, where this VBR is located, in this VBR only, we will have the code to load and invoke the OS. In this VBR only, OS loading code and invoking OS will be there. Once the OS is loaded, it will be invoked, and the VBR loads the related files of the OS to the main memory, and now the OS will take control. Once the OS takes the control, it will try to check. It will take a check of the hardware devices, and it will check for the drivers, and it will load the drivers, and it will check. After that, the booting process is completed, and we can use the computer as usual. This is the last, the OS taking the control and checking for the drivers is the last step in the booting process. We are once again discussing booting procedure is nothing but the process of the starting up of the computer. In this, when we turn on the power button, a reset signal will be sent to the CPU, and CPU will be reset. Its internal registers, CPU registers will be set. The CPU registers, they initialize in such a way that they will take the process to the starting address of the BIOS. Here in the BIOS, the post power on self test will be performed. It will check for the whether the basic hardware is correctly working or not. If it is correctly working, then only it will go to the next process. If it is correctly working, then all hardware devices will be initialized, like keyboard and drivers. Once the disk drivers are initialized, now the BIOS will check where is that MBR. Now the MBR is found. Once the MBR is found, it will copy that to the RAM, and it will switch the control, and the BIOS task is over. BIOS will go from the picture. Now the MBR, in the MBR we have the code to find the active partition. It is nothing but the code is there to find the VBR first. It will invoke the VBR. Who is invoking the VBR? Volume boot recorder, MBR. So this VBR, it will load the OS code and it will run the OS. When the OS is loaded, it is trying to run the OS. At that time, it loads the files to the main memory. Then VBR task is over, OS comes into the action. Once OS comes into the action, it will do the second check for the hardware devices, and it will load all the drivers, and the computer is ready for the use. Again, we are discussing when the computer is turned on, we are sending a signal to the CPU, that is a reset signal. CPU will be reset and the registers will be set. The registers will take the initialization process to the BIOS starting address. Once the BIOS starting address, the BIOS will try to perform the post. After the post, the hardware devices, once they are in normal condition, then they will be initialized and all the disk drives will be initialized. Now BIOS will check for the MBR location in these disk drives. And MBR location generally it will be kept in the starting 512 bytes only. Otherwise it will take more time to find where is this MBR. So in those 512 bytes we discussed what are there actually. Bootloader and partition table. Now here the MBR will invoke the VBR. VBR will load the OS and it will run the OS and it will copy the important memory information to the memory, main memory, and then OS takes the control. After taking these OS files only copied to main memory. After taking the control, OS takes the control and it will load the drivers, and now your computer is ready for the usage. This is what we call as a booting process.